So in a way, this sermon is a preview of what I have planned for our kickoff in the fall. We'll be doing a series on the Semites. This is a sermon about Abraham and Sarah. So our God is a God of promises, promises of a good life, promises of peace, of forgiveness, of eternal life. God has been making promises for as long as we have been aware that God is. One of the first promises that we have on record is the promise that God made to Abraham when he was young and plotting out his life. A simple promise, really. The Spirit of God came to Abraham and said, "Look up into the sky and count the stars." As Abraham was looking up and counting the millions of dots of lights, God told him clearly that he would give to him descendants that were more numerous than the lights that he could see in the nighttime sky. At the time that that promise was made, that was the same as saying to Abraham, "I promise you that your life will have value and meaning, that it will count for more than you could possibly understand." If you're going to make promises like that, I suppose the best time to make it is when people are young, because young people take to promises, especially if the promises that somehow, some way, they are going to be important, famous, powerful, or otherwise noteworthy. Abraham was certainly young. As soon as he found out that he was supposed to be the father of nations, he ran out and found himself a wife. Sarah was her name. Abraham was, because of the time that he lived in, a wanderer who likely dreamt of these kinds of things before God made the promise. Dreamt that his life would have deep meaning, that instead of just being someone who wandered around all during his life, he might be someone to whom others would turn, who would believe that he had wisdom and that they would be able to see the mark of God in his life. He may well have been dreaming that when he grew up, he would be king of the world, or at least the type of person that the world would admire and come to with gratitude. Most of us have some kind of dreams like that. I've always been kind of a broken dreamer. This is what I dreamt of. Being a Methodist pastor, I sometimes think should have shot higher, but here I am living the dream. When we are young, as a product of our time, we tend to dream that somehow, some way, the world will come to admire us, whether that's because we become famous or powerful or rich or otherwise noteworthy. We think, and we are fed by our society, this idea that if enough people know you or know of you and admire you or at least are jealous of you, that somehow your life will have whatever it is that God promised Abraham, meaning, and it will count and it will be satisfying when the time comes for it to come to its close. I believe those things are utter nonsense, so you'll know at the start, but it is the way that we conduct ourselves, right? Dream and dream big. Dream that you'll be the best that ever was at what you do, or at least way better than anybody else in town at it. Make sure that you have the biggest and the best and the most, and somehow your life has more import and meaning than it otherwise would. The word that we give those kinds of dreams that we carry around with us when we are young is, of course, hope. I hope my life turns out this way. I hope that I get to do these things. I hope people will feel about me the way I want them to. Abraham took the hope that God gave him, and his story progresses, and Abraham enjoys many blessings that seem to me to be abundant, but they are not necessarily enough for Abraham. He grows to be a well-respected elder of his people. He's not exactly king of the world, but other folks do come and ask him for advice and turn to him and pay attention to him. Sarah and he have the most odd marriage ever. If you've never read the story, you really owe it to yourself, right? If you think the Bible is a book of fairy tales, Abraham and Sarah will cure you of that notion. It was an up and down affair. It was an absolute disaster sometimes, but they hung together and they grew together, and somehow they formed together that thing that happens in a good marriage, which is to become one, inseparable, bonded by years of experience together. We find out as we read about their life's journey that Abraham and Sarah both had the same hope, the same dream. They believed the promise that God had made, that they would produce a child, and that child would become the seed of making Abraham the father of the nations. It didn't come true, though. And Sarah went through the hell of watching other women pregnant and giving birth and hearing the sounds of laughter and all those things that would haunt someone any time, but maybe especially in her time that was barren. And they got so desperate that they decided that they would strike a blow for the cause their own self, so they decided to have a surrogate. Again, it's amazing to me. We're talking about almost pre-Bronze Age at this point, and surrogacy was already there, right? So they have a surrogate mother so that Abraham can have his child, so they can get this hope thing off the ground and get it going. But it turns out that when the surrogate had the child and Sarah saw Abraham and his face lit up in that baby and that woman that had his baby, it didn't go well. It stopped short of murder, but not very much short of murder. They got kicked out and sent on their way, took care of them financially, but that was about it. And it did not prove to be that a surrogate was the answer. Here's the message behind that. It doesn't turn out that if you believe God has promised you something and he doesn't act fast enough that you should just go ahead. It proves itself over and over and over. He who waits patiently is rewarded. The birth of Abraham's child opened a deep wound in both of their hearts, and I think it probably was a type of exposure of what was inside, right? Of the angst and the fear and the anger that go in the human heart when what we have strongly desired does not come to pass, or at least it doesn't come to pass in the way that we think that it should. In Greenville, Texas, I think probably the wealthiest person that I have ever met. A very powerful man, head of a national corporation, and I won't say the name because it's not necessarily a pleasant story. I went to do house visitation in those days as an assistant pastor, and when I visited his house, I was amazed, still in my 20s, right? I had never been to an actual bona fide mansion. He had literally silverware that was worth more than me. But I noted even at that tender age that in spite of all the trappings of his life, that he in fact was trapped. And he wasn't happy. He did not have about him a sense of peace or calm or serenity, the things that I had always been taught money would purchase for him. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I didn't understand it. I thought he must be particularly broken because I've been told all of my life that power and prestige and money and those things bring peace. It was my first exposure to the opposite side of the truth. Anyway, Abraham and Sarah, they have no peace and they don't have what they've longed for and they can't go get it for themselves. And the story then just kind of rambles forward. There is not a lot going on except for continuing disappointment. The story as it's told shows them in different situations, different things happening, but the reader, as you live with them in that story, senses that all of it just doesn't have the depth of meaning that it would if they could lay down their burden of hope unfulfilled and get on with what they believed would be the finishing touch of their life. And you may know that biology catches up relatively quick. You do know that, don't you? Yeah, so I wasn't very old before I realized they were lying. Probably third grade, I realized that's a lie. When somebody said you can be anything you want to be, I already knew little, short, fat kids could not be Olympic sprinters, right? Wasn't going to happen. I was pretty sure nobody would put me in charge of the government either, so the president thing was off the... Age can be cruel. It's hard in our lives when we just lose our hopes. I've seen it because of what I do in some interesting ways. In Cleburne, Texas, we had a choir director who was extraordinary. He was amazing. Got just regular folk to produce music that was marvelous. But what a burnout case. So here's his hope story. He married a woman who I think he believed would heal him, and that she would finish him, right? Would be the finishing touch and make him whole or whatever, right? He kind of had it in his mind, his hope was if he just married the right person, that the brokenness that was in him would be cured. But he didn't marry a healer. He just married a woman. And none of it got cured. In fact, it spread like a contagious disease, and that marriage came unraveled in the most horrible public way that you can possibly imagine. He was so bad after that, right? The very sight of a couple holding hands or whatever would set him off. I learned not to let my wife come anywhere near the office if he was going to be in, right? It was just like poison spewing forth constantly. Hope, when it's disappointed, when it's left to rot and decay, it's a pretty ugly thing. It oozed out of his life, and all the beautiful music in the world could not cure it. I knew another man, a war hero from World War I, which I now realize is the coolest thing ever, right? I didn't realize I would be kind of the last generation that would know folks like that. I went to see him specifically because he was a Methodist, but he hadn't been to church for probably 20 years by the time I met him. He was in a rest home. But I went to see him because he was a war hero, and I've been reading about World War II and some about World War I all my life. I thought it'd be fascinating to ask him questions. So I asked him, tell me a little bit about your life, thinking he was going to tell great war stories. But mostly he told me about how important the tractor had been in transforming farming. True story, right? Where you go, I'm sure that's true, but I kind of came to hear something that I'm more familiar with. So I engaged him in conversation until I could turn the conversation to where I wanted it to go, because right, I could imagine myself writing this man's amazing story and being a best-selling author. Put that down on the disappointed hopes thing. I was shocked, frankly, when I finally got him to talk about it, right? So he went from just everything you would want to grow up to be, a gracious man who loved his life and was just fun to be with. He turned almost instantly into someone else. And what he said, excuse the quote, the president was a damn liar, a sentiment shared by many people in many different times, right? And then he went to tell me things they didn't teach me in school. Apparently, prior to World War I, Wilson was elected president by promising there would be no war. And then after he was elected, they went to war. So his story was this, right? That he was sure there was not going to be a war. Methodists were oftentimes pacifists at that time in history. And then there was a war, and he was made to go to the war. And his phrase has always stuck with me, right? Because he was a liar, I was made to go there and live in a ditch like an animal and watch my friends die. It wasn't exactly the rah-rah hero stuff that I had grown up reading about or that people kind of talked about when they talked about him. I learned quickly that he had medals for bravery, but he didn't care about them. He had hoped at some point in his life, at the end of that terrible experience, that what they said was true, that the war was so horrible that it would be the war that would end all wars. And at the time I spoke to him, Vietnam was quickly receding, and we were not in a war at that time, but it was obvious that that war had not ended anything. And in his deepest heart, he carried bitterness and disappointment at having failed by watching his friends die change anything except for the outcome of that battle. It's hard, isn't it? When the things you think will be true, when you think that your life will have made a difference, when you think that you'll get what you want, and it becomes obvious that not only will that not happen, but sometimes just the opposite happens, it's very hard. It throws us for a loop. He was in his late 90s by the time I talked to him, and he was still reeling from the pain of knowing it had all been, in his mind, a waste. Hope is a big deal. It sustains us and carries us through the vagaries of our youth. But when it turns in our later life, it is a vicious foe full of great strength. It can throw people into despair that is hard to overcome. Most of you probably know someone who says they don't believe in God. Yes? Nod if that's true. Is it just me? Maybe they particularly seek me out. I always think this. When someone says they don't believe in God, what they're expressing is bitterness at the failed hope that they had invested in the church. Us. All they're saying is, I took a look at the people of God and discovered you're not much different than any other people, right? So if that's what God does to people, I don't believe in God. Really, that basically is what they're saying. Makes me feel horrible, makes me want to try harder, but I don't think it has anything to do with God. They're just people without hope. They don't have hope any longer based on the evidence that an experience of God would change a human being to be something more than other human beings. So in a culture where large church, if you've got 10,000 members, you're better than another church. In that kind of culture, what is to differentiate us? The hope of Christianity seems to be that we would be as great as Walmart. I can't really blame those who take a look and say, that's no different than anything else, right? That's no different than Hollywood. If big and glitzy is all you want, then what difference does it make if you're following God or you're just living for yourself? I don't believe in any of that stuff. For the record, I don't either. I don't think we should put our hope in those kind of things. I don't think Abraham should have put his hope in his own ego and walked around all of his life thinking that he was going to be the father of nations and they'd maybe give him a ribbon someday. Well, here are the questions that I have, and likely you do too. I do not understand in all cases, or even most cases, why it is that hope so often disappoints. I do not understand how it can be that people, myself included, have so frequently thought that God himself was telling them to hope and to strive for some aim, only to discover that it was some kind of cruel joke. I don't understand what it is about relationships with God that so often leaves us in this bitter, unhappy place where we don't even know if there's a maker or if we're just an accident. I don't understand how it works that way. I just know that it does. Today I hope to unpack it a little bit. Let's look at Abraham and Sarah late in their life, when scars have done their work and covered over the great pain. The Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree while I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourself. Now, he is saying morsel of bread. He's about to tell Sarah to bake a whole loaf. You know that, right? Okay. And after that, you may pass on since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it, make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. What a good guy, right? What do you bet there was a well-worn path to Abraham's tent? They said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she's in the tent. And the Lord said, well, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. I'm only 54, but at Vacation Bible School, I had to say this sentence. Please don't jump into my arms, my back hurts. So they were jumping and clinging, but they just slid down with no assistance from me. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah, so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have that pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I didn't laugh. She was afraid. The Lord said, no, you did laugh. When we see Abraham in this picture, he's old and he's gracious and he's kind and he's learned a lot of important things about life, right? He knows to be a good host. He knows to be a servant to those that come by. He himself has traveled a long way in his life, and so he knows the value of being greeted and fed and fussed over by those who sit in the shade of their own tent, and he has gone on to do the same for others in his old age. It's a pleasant way, I think, to pass your life as you go into your old age at that time, being hospitable and kind, hearing stories of what's up in the wider world from your strangers who visit from afar. I don't think that he any longer had the hope that walking with God was going to make him king of the world or powerful or even noteworthy, but like we do with our own disappointed hopes, he had made his peace. And Sarah, too, as far as we know, she is gracious as far as she is asked to be. She cooks a good meal and plays her part in this story. The picture that is painted is one of two people who have experienced enough life to gain the wisdom that life itself is best lived in hospitality for others, a message that would take up almost all of the New Testament teaching in its time. They are people who have lived long enough to let some of the old wounds and dashed hopes settle into the past. It takes a while, doesn't it, to adjust to the reality of life as it stands in contrast to what we once hoped for. Can you remember? Do you remember what it was in, who knows, 6th, 7th grade, high school, college, that you were striving forward towards, that you were giving your time and energy to? I had it in my mind, honestly, because of the preacher thing, right? That if I could just preach the perfect sermon, something would happen. I didn't know what, vaguely understood that it would be noteworthy. I preached that sermon, I think, in my 3rd year in the ministry. Never happened again. Don't worry, I'm not confused. Just one time, it all came together, and the perfect sermon, as I define it, was staying within the confines of the Scripture, right, and saying only what Scripture said, but kind of poetically and in an interesting way. And I preached the thing, and I knew in real time, wow, this is I'm really hitting the mark, right? This is it. George Epp, who was the county sheriff of Boulder County at that time, fell sound asleep in the middle of the perfect sermon. And truly, he might have been the most excited man about it. Nothing changed. I came back to work the next week, and I discovered they expected me to produce another sermon for that Sunday and to get on about my business. We giggle a little bit, but if you're a preacher, that's a profound disappointment to discover, right? We're just bread makers. It takes a constant supply, and whether it's perfect or whether it's not, it's just got to be done again next week. You just learn to live into that truth and give up the hope that you had at one time that it was going to do something significant or magnificent. That's my story, right, for my own odd little path. I know you have yours too. I know there were things that you held in your heart and your mind and you thought, I really feel like God is in on this, right? And I'm going to go for it because when it happens, it'll be another thing that happened to another person. As you get older, sometimes people come into your life and they mock you a little bit, maybe open the old wound some. I realize at this age and stage, as I continue to study preaching and those kind of things, that I learned preaching as an art in a certain time period, and if I'm going to continue, I'm going to have to learn to preach in different ways. That's hard, right? To realize that they didn't teach us an eternal way to preach. It's just the way they taught us in the 80s, and times they're a-changing. Sometimes people will come and say to folks who had big dreams that lots of folks knew about, didn't you used to be, or weren't you supposed to be? One of the things that we wrestle with is this truth that we have on the table today. What we hope for and dream and strive towards frequently does not come true. When it does, it frequently disappoints, and yet the majority of our inner life for a long period of our life is devoted to those things. So Sarah's back in the tent, putting her tired back into motion for the sake of the visitors. And how do they say thanks? They tell her, hey, that thing that you dreamt about, right, when you were young and vibrant, it would have made a difference in your life, and you could have had a great life if it had come true. Now it's coming true. So here's a word of hope for all of you. If you were like me, very young and watching the Olympics and dreaming of being a 100-yard dash winner, a gold medal taker, it's not too late according to the Bible. And as soon as my SI joint pops in and I lose the 30 pounds that I've been trying to lose for the last decade, I'm going to start training. Or just learn to live with bitter disappointment. I truly cannot imagine what was running through Sarah's mind. Honestly, it's attributed in Scripture as if she's offended God, but how could God be offended? She's just being honest. That's stupid. I'm like 85 years old. I'm not having a baby. And not only that, if I do, what a sick joke. Right? I'm 20 and you say, hey, you're going to have a baby and you're going to be the father of all the nations, right, Sarah? You and Abraham are going to have a great thing. You live all your life thinking, then you do the hard work of letting it go. You heal the wound. You get on with your life. You make your peace. And then God shows up like a joker and says, it says that she laughed, which apparently is greatly offensive. Human beings are constructed so that laughter is a part of our defense mechanism. You may or may not know that. It precedes speech. And the reason when you laugh that you are paralyzed and unable to move is because laughter is a product of absurd. So laughter, they think, happened this way. Caveman was walking out and turned the corner and saw a saber-toothed tiger who saw him too, and he realized, I'm dead unless I run. And adrenaline pumped into his system so that he couldn't even think. All he could do was react, and he ran and he ran and he ran, and he outran the doggone cat. And the cat laid down in the heat of the day and died of a heart attack because the guy was so fast, and he needed to get rid of the excess adrenaline that was pumping through his veins. And laughter, you will note when it's genuine, paralyzes you. You can't do anything but laugh. And that's how your system dissipates adrenaline when you're pumped full of it. Did you know that? So when Sarah laughs, right, she is literally doubled over because it's such an absurd thing. It's crazy, and it is a way for her to dissipate some of the bitterness and anger that must have welled up inside of her because it's like a sick joke. That's all that happened. She just laughed at the absurd notion that this thing was finally going to happen. But God wasn't kidding. She did get pregnant. She did have a baby boy. He was healthy, and Abraham is now recognized as the father of nations. It's just that the thing took place without the joy and exuberance of youth and in the way that Abraham and Sarah wanted it to happen. It's as if they went to my World War I friend and in his 90s presented him a presidential medal for valor. He would have found that to be horrific. So they have the child, and then as a further test, and we'll talk about that in the fall, God says, now kill the child. This is the first significant story in the Old Testament as far as our understanding of the character and the way God acts and reacts amongst us. The first significant one. It tells us a great deal about God, and it tells us a great deal about us. It is just the fact that we don't want to know what it tells us. So why the delay in gratification? Why the dashed hopes? Why the weird twist in this story of the man that God promised, look, I'll if you do what I tell you to do, I'll make you the father of the nations? Well, as far as I can parse it out, and this should apply to you, it certainly applies to me. As far as I can parse it out, here is what actually happened if you look at it from a removed view a little bit. The story progressed and the truth unfolded in this way. In the beginning, Abraham thought it was about him and that it would bring him glory and that God was there to serve his desires and wants and needs, and he was willing to make that deal. But that is not how God operates. Never. I had a guy in Longmont at the church, really a sweet fella, just delusional. He used to come up with some eerie frequency and talk to me about the lottery. And here was his pitch, right? Because you may or may not know, if you talk to me, it's like talking to God because I know God. His prayers failed him, so he started to talk to the in-between. And what he would say is, if I win the lottery, I will tithe to the church, not only from the winnings, but I'll invest the stuff that's left over after the tithe, and I'll tithe out of those winnings. Pastor Steve, I just want to do something wonderful in my life, and I really think that would fit the bill. How many agree with Brad? Yeah. It amused me at first, and then it annoyed me, and then my worst self came to the fore. You'll be surprised to find out that occasionally I can keep him at bay, so I never said very much except for, well, Brad, we're Methodists, and technically the lottery is not allowed in Methodism. You may not have known that. I might have just disappointed your hopes too. The real problem with Brad's hope that he would win the lottery and then become a great, fine, wonderful servant of God is that Brad didn't tithe when he was making the promise. He had it in his mind he would tithe when he had enough money to tithe. But even if he was a tither, I don't think he would have won the lottery. Brad kept thinking everything religious and having to do with God had to do with Brad being at the center. Really, right? He would win the lottery, he'd be in the newspaper, he would tithe, everyone would say how generous he was. Do you hear the theme? It's Abraham's theme and Sarah's theme. God is going to do this thing that I want. He's going to give me the things that I desire. I'm going to have everything the way that I want it to be. It will be a significant life. It never works that way. If it does, you have become a narcissist, and there's something very, very wrong. And none of the rest of us see it. That's true. So the story of Abraham and Sarah, this bitterness of this horrible kind of joke thing, it plays out like this. Look, the story tells us if you're going to mix it up with God, who does in fact exist, here's how it goes. However long it takes and however difficult the journey, you're going to have to put God in the center and vacate that spot your own self. And if it means you don't get to have a baby until you're 85 in your particular circumstance, then you don't get to have a baby until you're 85. If it means that you have to live to be a fool because you're still chasing young men's dreams when you're an old man, then you're going to have to live through a season of embarrassment. When you deal with God, the first thing, the primary thing, the most important thing that has to happen is you must vacate the center and allow God to be there so that you define your life's good and your life's hope and your life's fulfillment as being a good servant of the known will of God. In his dealings with Abraham, we have a very clear picture that's disconcerting and frankly unpopular, but true. Abraham had the child at the only time in his life when he could have the child as a service to God and not as a point of exclamation about Abraham's importance. God delivers on everything he promises when we do our part in the relationship and we allow our lives to be given over to the service of our higher power. Not when we leverage the higher power and get God to be the one who gives us what we want, because what we want is temporal, not eternal. My God, if he gave every believer their dreams and what they wanted, what a horrible world it would be, because it would be populated by Christians who thought they were the center of the universe. Wait, that might be happening. The fundamental lesson of faith is that God sits at the center, and you got to make your peace with that. That bitterness you feel when your hope dies, the hope that you carried around that was all about you, that's a necessary part of growth. And it can be replaced by things that maybe don't sound as grand or as amazing, but are so much better. I thought the perfect sermon would happen, and then who knows? Great things, amazing things. They sent me from Boulder, where that perfect sermon was preached, to Julesburg, which is like, frankly, going to hell. Does that seem right to you? It's a proving ground. Tell you what, Julesburg, you're not the center of anything. I don't know why I was called to preach. No idea. I know it's been a great source of joy for me, right? It's like playing a game every week. I just love doing it. Wait a minute. God gave me something to do in which I could even accidentally serve him at the same time that I was enjoying myself. And even if I'm never going to be famous or of note or whatever, it's been a great way to spend my life. And he gave me Marilyn, and the same thing is true there. We're not going to appear in a magazine as the couple you should most aspire to be like, but we don't care, because we are, in fact, the couple you should most aspire to be like. Because for each other, in truth, in our marriage, we strive to serve God by the way we are married to one another, and that brings a peace and a contentment that nothing else that I've ever dreamed about could possibly match. Do you hear what I'm saying? So if your hopes have been disappointed and you think, what's the matter with God, right? Why didn't I get what I want? How could it be this way? It's a horrible thing. It's not true. You're lying to yourself. You're beating yourself down. If you just take a deep breath and focus on this center truth, you're going to get what he promised when he is in the center, because that has to be for all of the things to take place. And when you receive his promises of fulfillment and peace and joy and eternal life, though they don't sparkle and shine like your own fanciful dreams, wow, they're worth way more. So here's my advice to you. If you're sitting on some scar tissue, or if you're in the middle of losing your hopes, or if you're despairing that it'll never come true, whatever it was that you thought would fix you that wasn't God, I would invite you to go out and do what we did at the Vacation Bible School. Go out, sit underneath the stars, look up and wonder what it would take for you to be a light that shined like that for another generation. It took 85 years for Abraham, but he made it. Let's pray.